The warriors of the Mudokons are the trained fighters that protect the ancient tribes and the cultures of their species from the continuing encroachment of the industrial forces of Oddworld. The Tomahawkers are the melee warriors. Armed with a massive club, they have intensive offensive capability and are able to deal out some serious damage and head bangings. As shown in the game, their clubs are made out of bone with rope or string, or actually kind of looks like skin to me, securing into place at its tip a massive gem or rock of some kind, which certainly looks like it would cause quite a bit of blunt force trauma. Interestingly, however, concept art for the Tomahawkers portrays this giant stone as a seemingly spherical orb that contains some kind of energy within it. I suppose suggesting that the Tomahawkers were originally going to, or maybe still do, just less visibly, use some kind of mystical power with their weapon. This explains why they have great offensive capability, yet still have the very weak defensiveness that average Mudokons do. In-game, Tomahawkers are created when Abe takes ordinary Mudokons to transformation shrines, which then zaps them and upgrades them into a Tomahawker class after paying 10 spoofs. I always thought this was kind of weird, but actually thinking about it, I've just realised I guess it's not really much different from what Abe goes through in the first two games. Get zapped with lightning and end up with new powers, except in this case it's slightly weaker than turning into a demigod that can destroy everything in its path. Instead, I guess via these shrines they get the mystical knowledge needed to be a Tomahawker warrior and use their weapons properly, which would explain why ordinary Mudokons can't just pick up a big stick of their own and go mental with it. I like this idea that there's a spiritual element to it. It's not like the Mudokons have just built up a barracks and are just literally training them as soldiers. And I also like the way it kind of shows, I'd argue, Abe becoming stronger and higher up in the native hierarchy. Like in the previous games, he was the one getting led by shamans and whatnot, to getting zapped with lightning to gain powers. Yet in Munch's Oddysee, he's now the one that's leading Mudokons and giving them powers by electrocuting the shit out of them. Perhaps one of the most interesting aspects about the Tomahawkers is their name. A tomahawk, of course, being an actual real-world weapon created by Algonquian people, Native Americans. And similarly, I'm just reading now, these weapons were originally created by getting a stone to use as the damaging bit and attaching it to a handle secured with strips of rawhide, animal skin. So it looks like what the Tomahawkers do too, like I suggested. I wonder if they use paramite skin. As the Oddworld wiki points out, the weird thing, of course, is that the Tomahawkers of Oddworld don't use these what has come to be known as tomahawks, or even the same type of weapon, an axe or a hatchet type thing, but instead use clubs, which are of course very different in what they do, in how they're used and cause damage. One cuts, the other bludgeons. However, I looked into it, and as the Penn Museum states, the word tomahawk derives from the Algonquian language meaning the striking instrument. It can refer to any kind of tool or weapon, wooden club, stone hatchet, iron hatchet, wielded by hand in woodworking or in conflict. So the Tomahawkers being called Tomahawkers but using clubs does actually make sense. You just have to go further back to the proper Native American meaning, as opposed to the narrower modern usage of the term as just being like a hatchet weapon. Prior to finding this out, I figured it was just another case of Oddworld naming weapons after other weapons that aren't the weapons that they're naming, like the Sligs shotgun-looking machine gun firing firearms being called blunderbusses. Presumably in order to support and get a better grip of their weapon, the Tomahawkers wear a big sewn leather and skin gauntlet that looks more like Harley Quinn's oven mitt in my opinion. Perhaps the most notable feature of the Tomahawkers, aside from the club, is the very distinct way the feathers on their heads are just spiked, bolt upright. This is a hairstyle that is more commonly known as the Jedward, but the Tomahawkers had it first. Interestingly, the concept art for them is basically like the same, except what would happen if they ran out of hair wax and sort of just had to slick their feathers back instead. It's also interesting to note the other differences between the concept art and the final design. Although in the rendered art the Tomahawkers have this kind of nonchalant look about them, and in the game they just look downright gormless with their wide open eyes, it seems to me, looking at the concept art, that originally Oddworld Inhabitants wanted them to look very mean and badass. as you might expect the warriors of a proud race to be. This look carries on through to the Mudarchers, the marksmen of the Mudokon military, who at least retained this badassery for their rendered art. Alas, likewise in the final game, they appear slightly less expressive and ended up looking like the neutral face emoji. And looking at this image, this looks like it'd make a fantastic reaction image actually. If I ever got emotes somehow, which I'm not intending to, I think this would definitely make a great "what" emote. And ironically, it would also make a good reaction to realising the Mudarchers, the Mudokons that shoot things, have multiple bullseyes painted on them. Maybe for practicing reasons, but it's very ironic that they literally have targets painted on their bodies, which they lack in the non-coloured concept art. As their name suggests, being a portmanteau, how do you say that bloody word?
Portmanteau.
Portmanteau, is that really it? Wow, okay. Being a portmanteau of Mudokon and Archer, Mudarcher, the Mudarchers carry a long-range weapon called a spruce bow. The name suggesting that it's ammunition which comes out in rapid-fire blue bolts, may be spruce shrubs or probably more likely some kind of mystical energy coming from the spruce shrubs. The spiritual nature of the weapon is further hinted at by the pinkish coloured gems, same colour as the one used in the Tomahawkers clubs, as well as the big blue gem in the middle that seems to extend out of the bow into a sharp crystal form. Perhaps this is why it's easily one of the most powerful and quickest rapid firing weapons in the game, with a faster fire rate than some machine guns, and with their long range can easily take down armies of enemies. Mudarchers are created the same way as Tomahawkers, paying 10 spruce at the transformation shrines. Except whereas Tomahawkers are transformed from normal Mudokons, Mudarchers are transformed from Tomahawkers. Introduced in Oddworld Munch's Oddysee, their arrival in the series marked a stark departure from the portrayal of Mudokons in the franchise, as up to that point, ordinary Mudokons were not seen to actively take up arms against the advanced organisations that threatened them. Indeed, I personally remember as a child before I played the game, because I didn't have an Xbox, seeing Munch's Oddysee in game shops and looking at the back cover of that image of the Tomahawkers fighting Sligs, and thinking, oh finally we get to actually fight back and attack the Sligs. Prior to that, the closest you could get was sneaking up behind a Slig and just slapping them repeatedly, which they can't die from unless I'm mistaken, so then it basically becomes the Oddworld equivalent of knockdown ginger, and you just have to slap them and run away before you get shot. Also, I always found it funny how on the back of Munch's Oddysee cover, they just put in this random Slig here that is very clearly from the previous games. I guess there must have been a gap there, so they wanted to fill it in with another Slig maybe, instead of having blank space. The fact that this is the first time in the series that Mudokons properly fight back against the industrialists shows what impact Abe's involvement has had with their society. Now with their chosen one among them, the Mudokons have begun to rebuild and get stronger, to the point that they're now building armies of their own to combat the threats to their existence, which explains why we don't see them doing this in the previous games, but now suddenly we do in Munch's Oddysee. It isn't really outright stated in the game, or even made that clear in my opinion, but this point marks the true beginning of the Mudokon resistance, which is why they're training these menacing Mudokon martial mother-arms to be the spiritual successors of the ancient warriors of their tribes. They're developing for war against those that would oppress them, and I think a level that portrays this really well is Fuel Fields, which is the level that introduces Mudarchers, if I recall correctly, and allows you to build up a whole army of them to take on a Slig army at the end, and it's just epic. It really makes you feel like a general commanding your troops to take down the enemy forces in a firefight, and it's just one of my favourite moments from Munch's Oddysee. I suspect the introduction of more combative Mudokons was also setting up and intending to lead us towards the unreleased Oddworld game Hand of Odd, that would probably have portrayed even bigger battles on an even epicer scale. It would surely be epic if we got to see true mass-scale combat in gameplay between the industrial forces and the warriors of the Mudokons.
Hello, follow me. You.